I want to start out with the point that the cartridge itself is definitely not the only thing that impacts the overall effectiveness of a handgun. How you use that handgun matters a great deal. If you are a young Winston Churchill fighting against enemies armed with swords or spears, the fact that your Mauser pistol has only a .30 caliber bullet matters very little. Churchill demonstrated that you can easily and methodically kill such enemies by shooting them in the face. Churchill would obviously be able to do the same thing with the standard issue Webley revolver and its much larger .455 caliber bullets. However, the Mauser pistol had higher capacity and far faster reload. I should also mention two key things. The first being that this was not a pistol that was issued to him, it was one that he personally bought. The second being that during this time it was still widely believed that a large caliber was needed for military use. The belief that a large, slow .455 caliber bullet actually had the ability to knock a man down persisted for a very long time. Aside from how obviously and demonstrably wrong this belief is, it shows that people don't always look at combat, or anything else for that matter, in an objective way. You can immediately tell someone is biased and not objective when they say something like, "Well, he would have dropped right there if he had been shot with a .45. Elmer Keith would be one of these people. We can contrast Churchill's experience with the American soldiers who fought in the Philippine-American War. These soldiers were at first issued .38s. However, soldiers began to complain about the effectiveness of the .38. These handguns were obviously inflicting fatal damage, but the fierce Moros were still able to cut down American soldiers despite their fatal wounds. Once enough of these complaints stacked up, the .38s were recalled. It's important to point out that the .38s were said to be effective for fighting in Cuba, but not in the Philippines. Regardless of where the battle is fought, humans have the same biology. It is the determination of the enemies involved that gave different results. Even with .45s and .30-40 Krag rifles, soldiers were still having problems stopping the charging Moros. The problem wasn't really being solved with a different caliber. However, if you look at the location of the wounds inflicted, a solution becomes immediately clear. If someone runs at you with a knife, you can either shoot them in the brain or shoot them in the pelvis and break it. Either method would effectively guarantee immediate incapacitation. However, the situation would totally change if the enemy is armed with a gun instead. Some of these soldiers were clearly using expanding .45 rounds. However, it seems that the .30-40 Krag rifles were only being used with round-nosed full metal jacket ammunition. When we go to more recent history, we find that there was a study starting in 1959 that involved law enforcement officers who were shot in the line of duty. An unexpected byproduct of this study was the realization that there were repeated instances of both criminals and officers being shot with .38s and being able to continue the gunfight or flee. I have two of the cases that were involved in this study. Case 47 involved a struggle with a suspect armed with a pistol. During this struggle, the suspect was shot 5 times in the chest, and then he fell down, still armed. After this, the suspect got back up and was about to shoot an officer before he was shot in the head and killed. Case 69 involved a suspect who opened fire on 2 officers while sitting inside his car. Both the officers and the suspect were using .38s. The suspect was hit 11 times while sitting in his car, then he got out and wounded one of the officers. The other officer then hit the suspect with 4 more rounds, causing the suspect to finally collapse. The Sacramento Police Department saw the fact that criminals were becoming increasingly heavily armed with automatic rifles and machine guns. They probably also saw the previously mentioned study and the fact that .38s weren't always incapacitating. They realized they needed to make some changes. Specifically, they wanted a weapon that would be more likely to incapacitate both multiple assailants and single assailants. The obvious answer was to switch from revolvers to a higher capacity 9mm pistol. If you have a 9 loaded with a lot of jacketed hollow points, this gives you the ability to inflict far more damage on an assailant or multiple assailants. There really isn't anything wrong with the .38 special cartridge itself. It's mostly the fact that the ammunition that was being used is not doing the job that well. A secondary problem would be the fact that you can only make a revolver cylinder hold so many rounds before it becomes impractical and bulky. Regardless if it's a 38 or 44 Magnum, a non-expanding round is unquestionably less effective than an expanding round. There are obvious exceptions to this rule in specific situations that require maximum penetration. I would also say that non-expanding round-nosed bullets are particularly lacking because they do even less damage than a flat nose or wide flat nose non-expanding bullet. Both law enforcement officers and American soldiers in the Philippines were extensively using such round-nose lead ammunition. I also have to put in the disclaimer that for hunting, you'd ideally want to have the bullet exit and leave a large wound. This is different than a good self-defense round because you don't want it to exit an average-sized human and consequently endanger a bystander. It was never officially confirmed, but some LAPD officers were told that the switch from 38s to 9mm handguns was caused by a robbery of the Jin Hang jewelry store in 1985. 2 officers responded to a silent alarm and had a serious gunfight with the robbers. One officer, Dwayne Johnson, died in this gunfight against the 3 suspected gang members. Reportedly, the surviving officer, Archie Nagao, told Chief Daryl Gates that both officers likely would have survived if they had higher capacity 9mm. I don't know for sure if this is what caused the LAPD switch to 9mm, but it's entirely plausible. However, even with modern jacketed hollow points, we still have instances of people being shot multiple times with handguns and not being immediately incapacitated. This sort of thing tends to happen more often with handgun ammunition that does relatively low damage, but it can also happen with rifles, like mentioned before with the 30-40 Krag. However, even if your heart is shredded by a 12-gauge birdshot round, you may still have enough oxygen, adrenaline, and determination to keep fighting for a short time. Also, if you have someone who is disconnected from reality due to mental illness or drug use, they may show little or no response to being shot. Now for 357 Magnum. It's simply a more powerful and more damaging descendant of the 38 Special. Like the 38 Special, it saw a lot of law enforcement use. You could easily consider it to be the evolution of the police handgun that happened after the 38 Special and before autoloaders became really popular and replaced it. Back when bullet technology wasn't as good, the 357 Magnum had a dangerous lack of penetration when light, high-velocity bullets were used. This was not particular to the 357 Magnum, as both the 38 Special and the 9mm had the same problem. In comparison, 45 ACP generally had good penetration with most of the hollow points tested at this time, so for a long time it made much more sense for departments to switch from revolvers to 1911s and 45 instead of some 9mm handgun. So when you hear someone saying that we switched to 9mm because bullet technology has advanced, you should remember that the statement about bullet technology being approved across calibers is not some great insight. Since we've gone from a period where basically all 9mm rounds were not good enough to a time where most 9mm rounds are good enough, all calibers were positively affected, but some calibers needed it more than others. I'll also briefly mention the 41 Magnum. This is one of the calibers that never really became that popular. A large reason for this is that many people already had 357 Magnums. So if you already have a powerful and capable handgun, it's kind of hard to justify the expense of switching over to a less common 41 Magnum. The Nevada Highway Patrol was one of the departments that switched to the 41 Mag, but this would only last a few years. They had major difficulties getting the reloaded ammunition for practice use. Some of the men also complained about the recoil of the cartridge. So they switched back to the 357 Magnums, though they used 38 Special ammo for training and practice. Because of this lessened recoil, the officers had noticeably better scores. It is interesting that the year after the Miami-Dade shootout, 1987, there was a substantial increase in the amount of 380s and 9mm that were being sold. This was a noticeable departure from the 22s and the 25 ACPs that had been so popular before. This change seemed to be caused by the spread of cocaine and the resulting massive increase of gang violence. I'm sure the fact that more handguns were being produced in these calibers also helped. The first Glock 17s were being imported into the US in 1986, by the way. The Miami-Dade shootout has been wrongly framed as an example of how 9mm is an ineffective cartridge. During this shootout, a suspect shot in the chest with a 9mm continued to fight and kill people. In reality, the 9mm silver tip bullet used simply had too much expansion and not enough penetration to be effective. Remember, the cartridge is just the method of getting the bullet downrange. What actually does the damaging and killing is the bullet. One of the agents involved in this shootout, Gordon McNeil, even bought a SIG 9mm afterwards. This new P226 handgun had far higher capacity and therefore greater usefulness during an extended firefight than the .357 Magnum revolver he had at Miami-Dade. After Miami-Dade, the FBI started testing ammunition in 10% ballistics gel to determine which rounds had enough penetration to be effective. It was determined that there was a 9mm subsonic round that was as effective as a .45 with similar penetration. However, the .45 would always have a slight advantage due to its larger diameter. I want to briefly mention 10mm before talking about the checkered history of Winchester silver tips. The FBI eventually adopted the 10mm cartridge due to its high penetration and selected the Smith & Wesson 1076 as their standard pistol. Early testing with the original Norma jocketed hollow point showed deep penetration, but had two significant downsides. The high-pressure rounds were giving considerable recoil and causing excessive wear on the pistols that they were used in. So the FBI downloaded the 10mm to a 180 grain Sierra jacketed hollow point traveling at 980 feet per second. This kept the necessary penetration and overall performance and gave more controllable recoil. However, people today are still upset about the FBI's entirely reasonable decision to use a lighter 10mm load. Whether it's an assailant or a deer, they are just not going to be able to tell whether they were hit with a hot 10mm or a weaker 10mm. The original Norma load had no special properties, it was just the best that they had at the time. Today we have modern .40 Smith & Wesson bullets that are able to make equal or greater wounds than the original 10mm Norma load. The 10mm Norma load was almost 700 foot-pounds of energy on average, yet the modern .40 Smith & Wesson rounds shown here are only about 400 foot-pounds of energy. I've explained in other videos that whether we're talking about ballistics gel or actual human tissue, such fleshy substances have a great deal of elasticity. All the energy involved is not always directly translated into damage. Some of it goes into stretching but not tearing tissue. Winchester silver tips have gone through various generations over the years. The first generation of these rounds were created under the false impression that the duct sealant known as duct seal was similar to human flesh. So the first generation silver tips performed quite well against particularly menacing containers of duct seal, but were noticeably lacking in expansion and effectiveness against humans. A shooting in Illinois demonstrated this problem. A suspect was shot 13 times, with the majority of the rounds, 8 of them, exiting the body. Of the 5 bullets that didn't exit, only 3 of these really expanded. The second generation of silver tips generally expanded too much. This was the type used in the Miami-Dade shootout. However, by early 1986, the third generation of silver tips proved to be quite effective in real-world use. Police now had significant faith in this ammunition, and the bullets are still being manufactured today. More recent history is more widely known. The FBI wasn't entirely satisfied with the 10mm, so they worked with both Winchester and Smith & Wesson to get a cartridge that would be shorter, which is an advantage for smaller framed guns, but still had the desired performance. The result was the .40 Smith & Wesson, which was widely used by law enforcement agencies, though recently the trend has been to move away from the .40 and towards the 9mm. Again, this decision has been one of practicality. 9mm has low recoil, high capacity, low cost, and even less wear on pistols. People will also use various wars to justify their belief that a particular cartridge is better than another one. Masad Ayub will say that combat shows a .45 is more effective than a 9mm, while Alan Bristow will say that combat shows high-velocity rounds like 9mm are better than .45s. Both people give you a conclusion, but they don't include any evidence that would prove that this conclusion is true. If someone states their belief as simple indisputable fact, that's a huge warning sign that you need more information before you can make an informed conclusion. Practically speaking, regardless if we are talking about surgery or autopsy, unless you actually recover a projectile, it's hard to tell if someone has been shot with a 45 or 9mm. The case I'm showing involved full metal jackets, but the point still applies even when hollow points are used. Just by looking at a wound, you can't tell if it was made by a marginally expanded 45 or a 9mm that expanded well. When the Illinois State Police switched to 9mm, they chose a particular type of ammunition because they believed that a lighter bullet and higher velocity was inherently better. Even today, people still debate about whether a slow and heavy bullet is inherently better than light and fast bullet. This particular argument was always bizarre to me because it excludes all the important real-world factors like penetration and expansion in order to bring the argument down to the level of abstract thought and personal belief. If the goal is to inflict significant and fatal damage, it's basically irrelevant by what method you use to achieve that goal. A more meaningful addition to the discussion would be something like the following. Larger calibers like 45s have thicker sidewalls, which means hollow points do better when shot through barriers. However, higher velocity cartridges with smaller diameter bullets, when used with non-expanding rounds, generally have greater penetration through bone and other barriers. With hollow points, they also seem to be able to expand at longer ranges than 45s do. Paul Harrell mentioned this in the video where he explains why he uses a 38 Super instead of a 45 for deer hunting. Finally, extreme defender style bullets directly do more damage as velocity increases, so this technology favors high velocity cartridges more. I mentioned the fact that smaller diameter bullets can penetrate more. A practical example of this would be the fact that this 9mm Winchester ammunition can penetrate a steel M1 helmet out to at least 130 yards. Yet the 45 ammo only penetrated the helmet out to 30 yards. This principle applies to barriers in general, not just outdated steel helmets. Now that we've gone over a lot of handgun-related information, I'd like to say a few things about rifles, specifically starting with the Norco shootout and the resulting impact on law enforcement. On May 9, 1980, 5 heavily armed men robbed a bank in Norco, California. This resulted in a wild police chase and a significant gun battle. The responding officers were at a noticeable disadvantage, especially during the beginning of the gunfight. This was because the officers were primarily armed with revolvers and some shotguns. The robbers had rifles. It was a defining moment during the gun battle when a deputy arrived with a confiscated M16 and began spraying automatic gunfire at the robbers. This M16 was actually stolen from the U.S. Army by some miscreant, and apparently the Army didn't want it back. So it was because of one deputy's willingness to bend the rules that this rifle could be used to prevent more officers from being killed or wounded. Norco is one of the major incidents in law enforcement history that illustrated the lack of firepower that revolvers and shotguns have in comparison to semi-auto rifles. After this robbery, the law enforcement agencies in the surrounding area were concerned that such an incident would happen again. This is why they scrambled to buy new weapons, specifically semi-automatic rifles. This was before AR-15s were as popular and cheap as they are today, so generally agencies ended up buying Ruger Mini 14s. An interesting side note to this story was Riverside Sheriff Ben Clark. He was extremely hesitant to let his deputies have new guns due to his concerns about the image of the department. His deputies really did not like that, and some even started carrying privately owned rifles hidden in the trunks of their patrol cars. Ben Clark even went as far as saying that he would fire any deputy found to be carrying an unauthorized rifle. Because of the way Ben Clark handled this, not only his deputies, but some of the general public as well, lost faith in him. After Clark retired in 1986, the new sheriff, Coy Spurd, had the deputies issued the semi-automatic handguns they had been asking for. I know I mentioned this before, but let's talk about Miami-Dade again. This shootout involved multiple FBI agents intending to arrest 2 armed suspects. However, the FBI agents lost the gunfight essentially to a single man, Michael Platt, who is armed with a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. There are two main lessons people should take away from this incident. The first is to use ammunition that can penetrate 12 inches of ballistics gel. Michael Platt was shot in the chest with an under-penetrating Winchester bullet. This bullet stopped only an inch away from Platt's heart and would have obviously led to faster incapacitation if it had adequate penetration. The second main takeaway is that less people would have been injured or killed if even one of the agents was armed with a rifle. John Hanlon was one of the agents who was there. He stated that if he had an M16, he would have been able to stop Platt from coming around a vehicle and killing everyone. I also want to briefly mention the North Hollywood bank shootout. This involved another bank robbery that led to an extended gun battle with police. Again, the police found themselves significantly outgunned by the criminals. The officers soon realized that their .38 revolvers and 12-gauge shotguns loaded with double-aught buckshot were having no effect due to the robbers' body armor. Some of the responding officers even had to resort to acquiring 5 AR-15 style rifles from a nearby gun store in order to have more firepower. This gunfight between two suspects in the Amarillo PD is far well less known or influential, but it's still worth mentioning. During a car chase/gun battle, two officers emptied their .38 and .357 Magnum revolvers into the two suspects' stolen vehicle, a pickup. However, the pickup was only stopped when an officer fired 15 shots from a .30 carbine into the vehicle, killing one suspect and seriously wounding the other. After the shootout, the officers inspected the bullet holes in the vehicles and found that the .38s did very superficial damage. The .357 Magnum rounds were a little more effective. It was then concluded that the officers were generally outgunned, and 25 Remington 870 shotguns were purchased to remedy this problem. They also made a point to express the belief that superficial damage to vehicles is bad, and that they want bullets to expand and do more damage to the vehicle itself. I don't understand this logic in the least, as the suspect's vehicle itself is not a threat. It's merely a barrier between you and the threat. There was also some ammunition testing done, but the effects of unspecified handgun ammunition on a 1952 Buick Roadmaster is probably not that relevant anymore. Likewise, the ability for cartridges like .38 Super and .357 Magnum to penetrate 1920s era automobiles holds little value today when today's vehicles use thinner sheets of metal. This theoretically could be more of a concern if criminals start driving Teslas, which if you didn't know, they have thicker metal sheets on their doors than regular cars. The fact that the doors and body of a Tesla Cybertruck can stop common handgun rounds like 9mm and .45 is a very good thing when you consider the fact that the lithium-ion batteries could easily catch fire or explode if penetrated by a bullet. Finally, some people today like to talk about how shotguns are so great for law enforcement use. Now, I like shotguns, but I think their limitations tend to outweigh the benefits for the average officer. One Southern California department in particular highlighted the problems that they were having with shotguns. At longer ranges, like 40 or 50 yards, the pellets are essentially useless. Since the buckshot spreads out with range, officers also have the problem where they can't shoot suspects sometimes because of the high chances of hitting a bystander with the stray pellets. You could solve these problems by using slugs, but that won't solve the other problems inherent to most shotguns: slow reload, relatively high recoil, and low magazine capacity.